"Get out of here now, before I call for backup." The police officer's voice echoed through the silent bar, cutting through conversations like a sharp blade. The sound of glasses being placed on tables and chairs creaking filled the atmosphere as all eyes turned to the two black men sitting quietly. In the corner, their beers still half full on the dark wooden table, condensation drops running down the cold glasses. "Let me tell you this story as it really happened, my dear ones. My name is Dolores Johnson. I'm 73 years old, and these two young men you're about to meet are my grandsons. Identical twins, born just 3 minutes apart on a cold December night, but life took them down completely different paths, though equally honorable ones. I raised these boys after I lost my daughter in a car accident when they were only 8 years old, and I can proudly say they became men any grandmother would be proud of. Marcus, the older by those 3 minutes he never lets Michael forget, was always the quieter and more reflective of the two. Even as a child, he had this ability to observe a situation from all angles before acting. At 35 years old, he carried on his shoulders the responsibility of being a Chicago police captain, a position he earned after 15 years of impeccable service, starting as a patrol officer on the city's most dangerous streets. His hands, large and calloused from years holding weapons and handcuffs, held the beer glass with the same controlled firmness with which he conducted department meetings, always measured, always thinking 2 moves ahead, always considering the consequences of each action. Michael, his twin brother, had the same angular face, the same imposing height of 6 feet 5 inches, the same deep brown eyes they inherited from their father, but carried scars that Marcus would never have. Some visible, like the thin line cutting through his left eyebrow, a reminder of a mission in Afghanistan. Others invisible, etched in his soul by 12 years serving his country as a Navy SEALs commander, leading missions in territories that not even I, his own grandmother, had authorization to know about. His eyes had that silent intensity of someone who had seen too much, but still deeply believed in justice and the duty to protect the innocent. On that Friday night, March 15th, the two had met at Murphy's Pub, an authentic Irish bar in the city centre, with exposed brick walls decorated with Irish flags and black and white photographs of Dublin. It was where they religiously met once a month when Michael was on American soil, a tradition they had maintained for over 10 years. It was a sacred ritual between them, 2 hours to be just brothers, not officers, not war heroes, just Marcus and Michael catching up, talking about their lives, their fears, their hopes. The atmosphere at Murphy's was welcoming that night. Sean O'Malley, the 60-year-old Irish owner with an accent still heavy from Dublin, had put traditional Irish music on the sound system. The smell of fish and chips mixed with the aroma of beer created a familiar atmosphere. There were about 15 people in the bar, an elderly couple at the main counter, 3 college friends playing pool in the back, some office workers decompressing after a long week, and 2 women in their 40s celebrating a birthday. Marcus had arrived first, as always. Punctuality had been an obsession of his since the police academy. He chose their usual table in the right corner of the establishment, from where he could see both the main entrance and the back exit, a professional habit he had never been able to abandon. He was wearing dark jeans and a navy blue dress shirt, no tie, trying to look as civilian as possible. Even so, there was something in his posture, in the way his eyes periodically swept the environment, that betrayed his profession to those who knew what to look for. Michael arrived 15 minutes later, apologizing for a delay caused by a last-minute call from the Pentagon. He wore khaki pants and a black polo shirt that accentuated his musculature, developed by years of intensive military training. Unlike Marcus, Michael seemed completely relaxed, but those familiar with military operations would recognize the way he sat, back to the wall, with clear vision of all exits, a position that allowed quick movement if necessary. "How was your week?" Marcus asked, pushing a cold beer toward his brother. Training new recruits, Michael replied, taking a long sip. Sometimes I wonder if this new generation has the necessary discipline. And you? How are things at the department? Marcus sighed, an expression of fatigue crossing his face. Complicated. We're dealing with more cases of police misconduct. It seems like every week I discover another officer who thinks the badge gives him the right to treat citizens like enemies. It was a conversation they had frequently. Both had dedicated their lives to public service, but saw daily how some of their colleagues tarnished the reputation of the institutions they so respected. It was at 9:47 p.m. that everything changed. Officer Rodriguez, a 42-year-old man with a protruding belly that stretched the buttons of his uniform and a graying mustache he stroked when nervous, entered the establishment with heavy steps that made the wooden floor creak. His partner, Officer Thompson, 26 years old, followed him like an obedient dog, clearly nervous and trying to imitate the veteran's arrogant posture. Rodriguez stopped at the entrance, his small, distrustful eyes sweeping the environment, until they landed on Marcus and Michael. Something in his expression changed immediately, a mixture of disdain and opportunism that anyone familiar with racial prejudice would instantly recognize. "Thompson," he murmured to his partner, loud enough for several customers to hear. "Look what we have here. 2 potential suspects." Thompson looked in the indicated direction, saw 2 well-dressed black men talking quietly, and frowned. "Are they doing something wrong, Rodriguez?" "They don't need to be doing anything wrong to be suspicious," Rodriguez replied with a cruel smile. 2 men like these, in a place like this, they definitely don't belong here. Marcus and Michael noticed the attention immediately. 15 years of police experience had given Marcus a 6th sense for tension, and 12 years of military operations had taught Michael to identify potential threats before they materialized. They exchanged a quick look. Silent communication developed over 3.5 decades of shared life. "Problems?" Michael asked quietly, without moving his lips. "Maybe," Marcus replied in the same way. "Let's see what they want." Rodriguez approached the table with the arrogant confidence of someone who believed he had all the power in the situation. Thompson followed him, trying to look intimidating, but mainly managing to look uncomfortable. The bar gradually became quieter as other customers sensed the growing tension. "Good evening, gentlemen," Rodriguez said, his voice loaded with false uncourtesy. "Identification documents, please." Marcus placed his glass on the table with deliberate care. "Good evening, officer. Is there any specific problem?" "The problem," Rodriguez replied, his mask of courtesy slipping quickly, "is that you don't look like the type of clientele that frequents this establishment. This is a respectable place for respectable people." The silence that followed was loaded with meaning. Sean O'Malley, who was cleaning glasses behind the counter, stopped what he was doing. The elderly couple turned to observe. The college students interrupted their pool game. Everyone in the bar knew they were witnessing something that went far beyond a routine check. Michael leaned slightly back in his chair, a movement that might seem relaxed to a casual observer, but which Marcus immediately recognized. It was the posture his brother assumed before a high-risk operation, apparently relaxed, but with every muscle prepared for explosive action, if necessary. "Interesting definition of respectable," Michael said, his voice low but clear, loaded with a meaning that the 2 police officers still couldn't fully grasp. Thompson, trying to impress his more experienced partner and establish his own authority, stepped forward. "Look here, we have a smart one. How about you 2 show your documents and stop trying to be funny?" It was at that moment that something fundamental changed in the situation's dynamics. Marcus felt that familiar sensation of cold, calm that always invaded him before making an important decision, the same sensation he had felt before arresting his first criminal, before his first promotion, before each decisive moment of his career. Michael, in turn, allowed an almost imperceptible smile to touch the corner of his mouth. The Same controlled smile that his enemies abroad had learned to fear in the seconds before their operations were discovered and neutralized. What Rodriguez and Thompson didn't know, couldn't even imagine, was that they were about to star in one of the greatest power reversals that Barr had ever witnessed. Two men who had dedicated their entire lives to protecting and serving, who had sworn to defend the Constitution and the rights of all citizens, were being treated as criminals for the sole reason of being born with dark skin. But truth, as I always taught my grandsons, has a peculiar and powerful way of coming to light when least expected, especially when it confronts ignorance and prejudice. If you're enjoying getting to know Marcus and Michael, and want to discover how two men of honor deal with injustice when it knocks on their door, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because this story is just beginning, and what happens next will show that sometimes justice arrives in ways no one can predict, transforming a night of humiliation into a lesson that will echo for generations. "Raise your hands where I can see them," Rodriguez ordered, his voice gaining a more aggressive and authoritative tone. "Both of you now, and no sudden movements." The bartender, Sean O'Malley, a 60-year-old Irishman who had emigrated from Dublin 40 years ago and seen everything in his years serving drinks in Chicago, nervously cleaned a beer glass while watching the scene unfold. His experienced hands, which had served thousands of customers over the decades, trembled slightly. He had known those two customers for over 5 years, always polite, always paid their bills without complaining, always treated the staff with respect, never caused any problems. But he also knew Rodriguez by reputation, and knew the officer had a problematic history in the neighborhood, especially when it came to African-American citizens. Marcus kept his hands visible on the dark wooden table, but deliberately didn't raise them. It was a calculated move. It showed cooperation without unnecessary submission. "Officer, with all due respect, we haven't committed any crime. We're consuming drinks we paid for with our own money in a public establishment during normal operating hours." "Don't give me that lawyer talk," Rodriguez spat, approaching even closer to the table, his intimidating physical presence filling the brothers' personal space. "I have 15 years of experience on the streets of this city. I know how to recognize criminals when I see them. You look like drug dealers, like you carry weapons, like you're always looking for trouble." Thompson, encouraged by his partner's aggressive posture and trying to establish his own credibility, decided to contribute with his own dose of prejudice. "Yeah, and I bet you don't even have steady jobs. Probably live off odd jobs, petty theft, maybe trafficking. How did you get money to drink in a place like this?" Michael closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply through his nose. It was a control technique he had learned during his intensive military training, controlling anger and adrenaline before they controlled his actions and compromised his judgment capacity. When he opened them again, there was a calculated coldness in his gaze that made some bar customers feel uncomfortable without knowing exactly why. It was the same look that had preceded successful operations in hostile territories. "Interesting theory," Michael said, his voice low but clear enough for everyone in the bar to hear every word. "Based on what exactly? On our appearance? On our skin color? On some specific criminal behavior you observed?" Rodriguez laughed, that unpleasant and harsh sound echoing through the increasingly tense environment. "Based on 15 years of street experience, boy. I know how you people operate. I know how you think. I know how to recognize trouble before it happens." What Rodriguez didn't know, couldn't even begin to imagine, was that he was talking to someone who had spent the last 12 years operating in some of the most dangerous and hostile territories in the world. Michael had led rescue missions in countries whose names couldn't be mentioned in public reports, had made split-second decisions that saved American lives, had faced trained and well-armed enemies who would make Rodriguez run home, crying for his mother. Marcus, in turn, observed every movement, every word, every nuance of the situation with the meticulous attention of someone who had spent 15 years studying criminal behavior and police misconduct. As captain, he had dealt with officers like Rodriguez before, men who stained the reputation of the entire corporation with their ingrained prejudices and systematic abuse of power. There were files on his desk about inappropriate behavior, citizen complaints, cases he had personally investigated that resulted in suspensions, dismissals, and even criminal charges. "You know what I think," Rodriguez continued, clearly enjoying the situation and the power he believed he had. "I think you're here to sell drugs to these rich white folks. That's how it works, isn't it? You infiltrate decent, respectable places to corrupt good people, to spread your vices and criminality." The elderly couple at the counter, Harold and Margaret Peterson, both retired and married for 45 years, exchanged deeply uncomfortable looks. Margaret, a former elementary school teacher with snow-white hair, whispered something to her husband, who shook his head negatively with an expression of disgust. They clearly didn't agree with what was happening, but also didn't have the courage to intervene directly against law enforcement officers. Sean O'Malley finally decided to speak, his voice loaded with Irish accent and years of experience dealing with difficult situations. "Officer Rodriguez, these gentlemen have been regular customers for years. They come here every third Friday of the month, always behave like perfect gentlemen. There's never been any problem, complaint, or incident." "Nobody asked for your opinion, Irishman," Rodriguez cut off brusquely, turning to Sean with evident contempt. "Mind your bar and let the police do their job. And next time, think better about what kind of clientele you want to attract to this establishment." The implicit threat in Rodriguez's words didn't go unnoticed by anyone. Sean swallowed hard, realizing that his business license could be at risk if he continued to defend his customers. It was at that moment that Marcus made a calculated decision. Slowly, keeping his hands completely visible and moving with exaggerated deliberation, he reached for the inner pocket of his navy blue blazer. Rodriguez immediately placed his right hand on his weapon, fingers closing around the grip. "Slowly!" Thompson shouted, also bringing his hand to his holster, his voice breaking slightly with nervousness. "Very slowly. Any suspicious movement and you'll have serious problems." "I'm just going to show my identification," Marcus said with supernatural calm. "Exactly as you requested. There's no need for unnecessary escalation." Michael observed the scene with growing interest and silent satisfaction. He knew exactly what his brother was doing, knew that strategy, and a part of him, the part that had been trained to neutralize threats and reverse seemingly impossible situations, was genuinely curious to see how those two officers would react when they discovered who they were really dealing with. Marcus slowly withdrew a genuine black leather wallet, placing it on the table with exaggerated care. "My identification is inside here, officers. May I open it?" Rodriguez approached even closer, keeping his hand on his weapon, sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the bar's efficient air conditioning. "Open it slowly and show it. And you," he pointed at Michael with his index finger, "keep your hands where I can see them." "With pleasure," Marcus replied, and there was something in his tone, a quiet confidence, a natural authority, that made Michael smile internally with anticipation. Thompson positioned himself beside his partner, trying to look intimidating and professional, but mainly managing to look nervous and inexperienced. "And you," he pointed at Michael with forced authority, "I also want to see your documents. Now." Michael tilted his head slightly, a gesture that might seem submissive to casual observers, but which Marcus recognized as the movement his brother made before executing complex tactical maneuvers. "Of course, officer. But first let my brother show his, one thing at a time, to avoid misunderstandings." The word brother made Rodriguez frown, as if the information were somehow relevant. "Brother? Your brothers?" "Twins," Marcus confirmed, opening the wallet with deliberately slow and controlled movements. "Born 3 minutes apart." Rodriguez looked from one to the other for the first time, really paying attention, noticing the impressive similarity that went far beyond skin color. The same facial structure, the same height, the same confident posture. Criminal twins. How novel. I bet you work together. Split the trafficking profits. Thompson laughed, a forced and unpleasant sound. Family that traffics together stays together until they're arrested together. What happened next would completely change the dynamics of that night and the lives of everyone involved. Marcus withdrew an official document from his wallet and placed it on the table, turned so Rodriguez could read it clearly. The officer leaned in to examine the document, and his expression began to change gradually, as if he were watching a movie in slow motion. First, pure confusion. The letters didn't make sense in his and prejudiced mind. Then, total disbelief. Surely that had to be fake. Finally, something that looked very much like absolute panic began to form in his small, distrustful eyes. Michael observed the transformation on Rodriguez's face with silent and professional satisfaction. He had seen that same expression on enemies when they realized they had gravely underestimated their opponent, when they discovered that the target they thought was easy was actually a much more dangerous predator than they were. The bar was in absolute silence now. Even the sound of the television in the corner, showing a basketball game, seemed to have diminished. Everyone felt that something monumentally important was happening, even without understanding exactly what. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Rodriguez swallowed hard, his hands beginning to tremble visibly. Thompson, noticing the sudden and dramatic change in his partner, tried to see the document, but Rodriguez blocked him instinctively, as if wanting to hide the evidence of his monumental error. "Is there any problem, officer?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm, but now loaded with a natural authority that wasn't there before, or that had been there all along, just masked by the situation. And it was at that moment that everyone in the bar realized that the night was about to take a completely unexpected and irreversible turn, because sometimes truth has the power to transform predators into prey in a matter of seconds, and justice has a peculiar way of appearing when least expected. Thompson, impatient with his partner's sudden and inexplicable silence, pushed Rodriguez aside with unnecessary force to see the document that had caused such transformation. When his young and inexperienced eyes landed on the official identification, his face paled instantly, as if all the blood had drained from his body in a matter of seconds. There, in clear official and incontestable letters, was written, "Captain Marcus Johnson, Chicago Police Department, Central District, Command Authorization Level 4. This has to be fake," Thompson stammered, his voice losing all previous authority and transforming into a desperate whisper. "It has to be a forged identification. It's not possible. It can't be real." Rodriguez remained in absolute silence, his hands visibly trembling now, drops of sweat forming on his forehead and running down his temples. He knew that name. Everyone in the corporation knew it. Marcus Johnson was more than a legend in the department. He was the youngest officer in history to be promoted to captain, responsible for important reforms in internal affairs, known throughout the state for his zero tolerance for police misconduct and corruption. There were stories about him, famous cases he had solved, corrupt officers he had exposed and fired. Marcus stood up slowly, each movement calculated and deliberate, his posture changing completely before everyone's eyes in the bar. He was no longer the man being intimidated and harassed. He was the direct, hierarchical superior of both officers in front of him, a man with the power to destroy careers with a single phone call. "Officer Rodriguez, Officer Thompson." His voice now carried the weight of 15 years of command and unquestionable authority. "Would you like to explain in detail the procedure you're following here tonight?" Michael remained seated, but his smile had become more visible and significantly more dangerous. He was genuinely enjoying the situation, watching how two men, who minutes ago behaved like Confident predators now looked like desperately cornered rats looking for an exit that simply didn't exist. "Captain, we... Rodriguez tried to form a coherent sentence, but the words simply couldn't come out of his constricted throat. His mind was in total panic, trying to process the magnitude of the error he had committed. Sweat began to form on his forehead more intensely, despite the bar's efficient air conditioning. "We received a complaint," Thompson lied desperately, his voice breaking under the weight of falsehood. "An anonymous complaint of suspicious activity at this specific establishment." Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, a posture that all his subordinates knew very well. It meant someone was about to have an extremely bad day, and possibly the end of their career. "What specific type of suspicious activity, Officer Thompson? And from whom exactly did this supposed complaint come? What protocol was followed? Where is the documentation?" The silence that followed was embarrassing and revealing. Thompson looked desperately at Rodriguez for support, but the more experienced partner was clearly in total panic, completely unable to formulate any coherent or convincing response. Sean O'Malley, who had observed the entire interaction with growing fascination and relief, decided to intervene with crucial information. "Captain Johnson," he said respectfully, his voice loaded with Irish accent, "these officers entered here approximately 15 minutes ago without any call, complaint, or request from us. They came directly to your table and began making accusations without any provocation or apparent justification." "Thank you for the information, Mr. O'Malley," Marcus replied professionally, without taking his penetrating eyes off the two officers. "Officer Rodriguez, you have 15 years of active service. You should know perfectly well that approach without probable cause constitutes civil harassment and can result in serious disciplinary action, suspension, and even dismissal." Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse and desperate whisper. "Captain, we didn't know who you were. If we had known..." "And does that justify your behavior?" Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting like a sharp blade. "Do you think it's acceptable to approach and intimidate innocent citizens based exclusively on their skin color? Do you think the badge gives you the right to humiliate people?" Michael decided it was time to join the growing fun. Slowly, he also stood up, his imposing height and musculature developed by years of intensive military training, making him look even more intimidating under the Ibar's yellowish lights. "My brother asked a very simple question, officers. Are you going to answer, or are you going to keep trying to make up excuses?" Thompson, desperate to save the situation that was rapidly getting out of control, committed the fatal and irreversible mistake. "Look, you may be who you say you are, but you still look suspicious to me. Two black men in a bar like this, at night, drinking expensive beer, that's not normal." The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed to have stopped completely. Marcus closed his eyes, and for a moment, breathing deeply, controlling the anger that threatened to explode. When he opened them, there was a coldness in them that made several bar customers feel genuinely uncomfortable and afraid. "Officer Thompson," Marcus said, his voice dangerously low and controlled, "you just admitted, in front of multiple witnesses, that your approach was based purely on racial profiling. You just confessed to a federal crime." Michael laughed, a low sound completely without humor. "Interesting, very interesting indeed." He reached for his own pocket, moving with the calculated and fluid precision of someone accustomed to life-or-death situations, where each movement could mean the difference between success and failure. Rodriguez, realizing that the situation was getting completely out of control and turning into a career nightmare, tried one last desperate gambit. "Listen, we can resolve this like civilized gentlemen. It doesn't need to become an official case. We can forget this happened." "Oh, but it's already an official case," Marcus interrupted with absolute authority. "The exact moment you decided to approach innocent citizens without probable cause, based only on ingrained racial prejudices, this automatically became an official case of police misconduct." Michael withdrew his own identification, but didn't show it immediately. Instead, he held it so only he could see the content, smiling at the two officers with an expression that mixed amusement and something much more dangerous. "You know, gentlemen, my brother here is known throughout the department for his diplomatic patience and professional approach. On the other hand," he made a dramatic and calculated pause, watching as both officers swallowed hard, sweat running down their faces. "I have a slightly different approach for dealing with people who abuse their authority and disrespect the constitutional rights of American citizens." The elderly couple at the counter, Harold and Margaret Peterson, had completely stopped pretending they weren't paying attention to the situation. Margaret whispered to her husband with a worried voice, "Dear, I think these police officers are in serious trouble. Very serious trouble." Sean O'Malley, who had witnessed many tense situations in his bar over 40 years of serving drinks in Chicago, had never seen anything remotely like this. Two men who had been treated as criminals were now clearly in absolute control of the situation, and the two police officers seemed to be gradually realizing they had committed a monumental and potentially irreversible error. Michael finally turned his identification so Rodriguez and Thompson could read it clearly. What they saw there made Thompson take an involuntary step backward, stumbling slightly, and Rodriguez looked like he was about to faint or vomit. "Commander Michael Johnson, United States Navy SEALs, Special Operations, Security Clearance Level Alpha." The complete realization of what they had done hit both officers like a freight train at high speed. They hadn't just harassed two innocent citizens. They had harassed and tried to intimidate a respected police captain and a commander of the U.S. Navy's Special Forces. Two men with connections and authority they couldn't even begin to imagine. Michael slowly put away his identification, his movements deliberate and controlled, each gesture loaded with meaning. "Now," he said, his voice loaded with an authority that came from years commanding men in life-or-death situations, "you're going to explain exactly, word for word, why you thought it appropriate to approach us in this racist and degrading manner." And it was at that precise moment that Rodriguez and Thompson realized that their night, and very possibly their entire careers, was about to take a turn they could never have imagined in their worst nightmares. Because when you underestimate the wrong people and reveal your deepest prejudices, the consequences can be more devastating and lasting than anything your limited mind could conceive. Marcus walked slowly to the bar, his measured steps echoing in the tense silence of the establishment, where Sean O'Malley watched the scene with growing fascination and evident relief. The Irishman had served drinks for 40 years, but had never witnessed such a dramatic and complete power reversal. "Mr. O'Malley," Marcus said with professional voice and natural authority, "do you have security and cameras functioning in this establishment?" "Yes, Captain," Sean responded promptly, his voice loaded with respect and cooperation. "Complete surveillance system with high-quality audio, 12 strategically positioned cameras, high-definition digital recording. The system continuously records everything for at least 6 months before overwriting the oldest files." "Perfect," Marcus replied with evident satisfaction. He turned slowly to the two officers who seemed to be physically shrinking with each passing second. "Officers, you have the constitutional right to remain silent, but as professional colleagues and members of the same corporation, I'm going to give you a unique opportunity to explain your actions before this becomes a formal and irreversible process." Rodriguez desperately tried to recover some composure, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Captain Johnson, there was a serious misunderstanding, an error in judgment. We can resolve this internally between colleagues without involving unnecessary bureaucracies." "Misunderstanding?" Michael interrupted, his voice loaded with controlled incredulity and something much more dangerous. "You called us drug traffickers, questioned our constitutional right to be here, made explicitly racist comments recorded on video. What specific part of that was a misunderstanding?" "Thompson," desperate and clearly out of his depth, tried a different and equally disastrous approach. "Commander, we serve our country too. We're all on the same side here. We all defend law and order." Michael laughed, a cold and calculated sound that made several bar customers shiver involuntarily. "The same side? Interesting perspective." He approached Thompson with fluid and intimidating movements, his physical presence making the young officer instinctively back away until he bumped into a chair. "Do you know how many missions I've led to specifically protect the freedom and constitutional rights of American citizens? How many times I've risked my life to defend exactly the principles you trampled tonight?" While Michael kept the two officers occupied and psychologically pressured, Marcus discreetly made an almost imperceptible signal to Sean, who immediately understood the silent message. The experienced bartender went to the bar's sound system and completely lowered the music volume, ensuring that every word of the conversation would be clearly captured by the security cameras without sound interference. Marcus then took out his cell phone, a movement that made Rodriguez and Thompson visibly more nervous, if that were possible. "I'm sending a detailed message to Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell from Internal Affairs," he announced calmly, typing with precision. "She'll want to personally review all tonight's recordings and interview every witness present." "Captain, please," Rodriguez begged, his voice breaking slightly with genuine desperation. "I have a family. 3 small children. I can't lose my job because of an error in judgment. My wife is pregnant with our 4th child. Please, be reasonable." Michael stopped walking and turned slowly to Rodriguez, his eyes fixing on the officer with laser intensity. "Family, children." His voice was dangerously low, loaded with controlled anger that was much more intimidating than any scream. "And you think my brother and I don't have families? That we don't have people who care about us, that we don't have the basic constitutional right to go out for a beer without being treated as criminals because of our skin color?" Marcus continued typing on his phone, but spoke without lifting his eyes from the screen. "Officer Rodriguez, in your 15 years of active service, how many other times have you made approaches based purely on racial profiling? How many other innocent citizens have you humiliated and intimidated?" The silence that followed was absolutely revealing. Rodriguez couldn't answer because any response would be incriminating. Admitting he had done this before would be confessing a pattern of criminal behavior. Denying would be an obvious lie in the face of evidence. Thompson, realizing that Rodriguez was sinking them both with his silence, desperately tried to distance himself from his partner. "Captain, I'm relatively new to the corporation. Only 2 years of service. I was just following the leadership of my more experienced partner. I didn't know I was doing something wrong." "Ah," Michael said, his tone loaded with cutting sarcasm. The classic just following orders defense, very original and creative. He approached Thompson again, his physical presence completely dominating the space. "You know that defense didn't work very well at Nuremberg, don't you? Did you study history at the academy?" Marcus finally lifted his eyes from the phone, an expression of professional satisfaction crossing his face. "Done. Lieutenant Mitchell will be here in exactly 20 minutes with a complete internal affairs team. She'll want to interview all witnesses individually and review all security recordings." The panic on Rodriguez and Thompson's faces was palpable now, visible to everyone in the bar. They knew their careers were literally hanging by an increasingly thin thread, and that every word they said from that moment would be documented and used against them in disciplinary and possibly criminal proceedings. Sean O'Malley discreetly approached Marcus, carrying a tray with clean glasses. "Captain, may I offer something to drink while we wait? Coffee, water, maybe something stronger? On the house, of course." "Thank you for the courtesy, Mr. O'Malley, but I think it's better we keep our heads completely clear for what's to come," Marcus replied professionally. He turned to the other bar customers who had remained as silent witnesses. "Ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for tonight's disturbance. If anyone wants to leave before internal affairs arrives, feel completely free to do so." Surprisingly, no one moved even a centimeter. The elderly couple at the counter, Harold and Margaret Peterson, exchanged determined looks, and Margaret shook her head firmly. "No, young man," she said with a clear and resolute voice. "We're going to stay. What happened here tonight isn't right, and if our presence as witnesses can help correct this injustice, then it's our moral and civic duty to remain." Michael smiled genuinely for the first time that night, a warm smile that contrasted dramatically with his previous expressions. "Thank you. Thank Mrs. Peterson. That means much more than you can imagine." Rodriguez made one last desperate attempt at salvation. "Captain Johnson, Commander Johnson, you're men of honor and integrity. Surely you can understand that everyone makes mistakes. Everyone deserves a second chance." Marcus interrupted him with a firm gesture of his hand. "Officer Rodriguez, you're absolutely right about one thing. We are men of honor, and that's exactly why we cannot and will not let this behavior pass." He made a deliberate pause, letting his words penetrate completely. "How many other innocent citizens have you treated in this degrading manner? How many people who didn't have our position, our resources, or our connections were humiliated, intimidated, or worse?" Michael nodded gravely, crossing his arms over his chest. "My brother is absolutely right. You didn't commit a simple mistake against us. You revealed a systematic pattern of behavior that probably affects dozens, maybe hundreds, of innocent people in our community." Thompson began to cry silently, tears running down his young face, as the reality of the situation finally hit him completely. Rodriguez, on the other hand, seemed to be going through all stages of grief simultaneously: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, in a devastating emotional roller coaster. Marcus looked at his military watch with precision. 15 minutes until Internal Affairs arrives. He turned to Michael with the look that only twins can completely understand. "Brother, do you have anything to add before this becomes officially irreversible?" Michael thought for a moment, then smiled. Not the cold smile from before, but something more calculated, more strategic, infinitely more dangerous. "Actually, I do." He took out his encrypted military phone. "I'm calling General Patricia Hayes from the Pentagon's Special Operations Command. She'll want to know personally that 2 of her civilian allies tried to intimidate and humiliate one of her most decorated commanders." Rodriguez's face lost all remaining color, becoming literally gray. They weren't just facing local departmental problems. Now there was the real potential for federal military involvement, with all the implications that could bring. And it was at that moment that everyone at Murphy's pub realized that Marcus and Michael Johnson weren't just victims who had defended themselves. They were experienced and highly trained strategists who had transformed a situation of racial humiliation into a masterful lesson in justice that would echo far beyond those 4 walls. If you're following this incredible story of how truth and preparation can completely turn the game around, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happens when Internal Affairs arrives will show that sometimes justice has an even sweeter taste when served by those who truly understand the weight of responsibility and the power of strategy. Exactly 18 minutes later, the heavy doors of Murphy's pub opened with dramatic force, and Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell entered, accompanied by 2 experienced Internal Affairs investigators, their steps echoing in the tense silence of the establishment. An African-American woman of 43 years, with impeccable military posture and penetrating eyes that forgave absolutely nothing. She swept the environment with the trained and meticulous gaze of someone who'd investigated hundreds of police misconduct cases over 15 years of career. "Captain Johnson," she greeted Marcus with military professionalism, then turned to Michael with evident respect. "Commander Johnson, I received your detailed message and came as soon as humanly possible. This situation has maximum priority." Rodriguez and Thompson were visibly trembling now, sweat running down their faces despite the efficient air conditioning. The presence of Internal affairs was literally the nightmare of any police officer with something to hide, and they knew their careers were hanging by an increasingly thin thread. "Lieutenant Mitchell," Marcus began with professional authority, "I would like you to immediately review the security recordings from the last 50 minutes. I believe you'll find clear and incontestable evidence of racial profiling approach, abuse of authority, and civil rights violations." But it was at that moment that the first dramatic plot twist happened. The bar door opened again with force, and a tall man in an impeccable, dark suit entered with commanding presence. Rodriguez recognized him immediately, and his face became even paler, if that were physically possible. "Captain Johnson," the man introduced himself with federal authority. "I'm Federal Agent Marcus Williams from the FBI Civil Rights Division. We received a priority call about possible systematic violation of civil rights by local officers." Michael smiled with satisfaction, but said nothing yet. He had done much more than just call General Hayes. He had activated a complex network of military and federal contacts that Rodriguez and Thompson didn't even know existed. Lieutenant Mitchell frowned professionally. "Agent Williams, this is technically an internal police department matter." "It was," the federal agent interrupted politely, but with absolute firmness, "until it became a federal civil rights issue, when law enforcement officers make approaches based purely on racial characteristics, especially against members of the armed forces. This automatically becomes federal jurisdiction." Rodriguez finally collapsed emotionally. "This can't be happening," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else, shaking his head in denial. "This can't really be happening to me." Thompson, on the other hand, tried one last desperate and completely inadequate gambit. "Agent Williams, Lieutenant Mitchell, these men are dramatically exaggerating the situation. It was just a minor misunderstanding, a routine check." It was then that Sean O'Malley intervened decisively, carrying a state-of-the-art tablet. "Actually," he said with evident satisfaction, "I've already separated and organized all the relevant recordings. High-definition audio and video, multiple angles." He carefully handed the device to Lieutenant Mitchell. "Everything is here, from the exact moment the officers entered until now. No edits, no cuts." The second devastating plot twist came when Lieutenant Mitchell began playing the recordings on the tablet, connecting it to the bar's sound system. Rodriguez and Thompson's voices echoed through the silent establishment with crystal clarity. "Get out of here now. You don't belong in this place. You look like drug dealers. I know how to recognize criminals when I see them. Two men like these, in a place like this." Each word was like a nail being hammered into the coffin of their careers. But the third and most devastating plot twist was yet to come. Agent Williams received a call on his encrypted federal phone. After a brief conversation in codes that only he understood, he hung up and turned to the group with a grave expression. "I just received extremely interesting information from our national database. Officer Rodriguez, you have 7 formal complaints for inappropriate conduct in the last 3 years, all, without exception, involving African-American citizens." Rodriguez physically staggered, as if he had taken a direct punch to the stomach. That doesn't prove anything specific." "Actually, it proves quite a lot," Marcus intervened, his voice cold as Arctic ice, "especially when combined with what we just witnessed and recorded in high definition." Michael decided to reveal his own ace in the hole, the most powerful of all. "Agent Williams, by the way, General Patricia Hayes personally confirmed that she'll be sending an official representative from Special Operations Command to closely follow this case. Apparently, when one of her most decorated commanders is a victim of racial harassment, they take it extremely seriously." The fourth plot twist was the most unexpected and impactful of all. The bar door opened once more, and an elegant and imposing middle-aged woman entered with absolute authority. Rodriguez recognized her immediately, and his world completely collapsed. "Chief Morrison?" he stammered with a broken voice. Police Chief Janet Morrison, a 52-year-old African-American woman who had fought against institutional racism throughout her 25-year career, looked at Rodriguez with an expression that could literally freeze hell. "Officer Rodriguez, Officer Thompson," she turned to Marcus. "With evident professional respect, Captain Johnson, I received your priority message. I came personally because this type of behavior will not be tolerated in my department under any circumstances." Thompson finally understood the complete magnitude of what had happened. They hadn't just harassed two random black men. They had harassed two black men who had direct connections at all levels of the justice system, the armed forces, and the federal government. Chief Morrison continued, her voice loaded with absolute authority and controlled anger. "Officer Rodriguez, Officer Thompson, you are immediately suspended without pay, pending complete and comprehensive investigation. Turn in your weapons, badges, and any departmental equipment right now." Rodriguez tried one last desperate and pathetic plea. "Chief Morrison, please, I can explain everything. I can justify my actions." "The only explanation I want to hear," she interrupted with absolute firmness, "will be during your formal deposition under oath to Internal Affairs, the FBI, and possibly a federal grand jury." Michael observed the entire scene with silent and professional satisfaction. In less than 2 hours, two men who had tried to humiliate them based solely on their skin color now faced the complete end of their careers, possible federal criminal charges, and the public humiliation of having their racist actions exposed. The fifth and final plot twist came when Sean O'Malley approached Marcus with an expression of malicious satisfaction. "Captain, there's something else you should know. This bar has a live streaming system to our official social media page. Everything that happened here tonight was automatically transmitted to our followers." Rodriguez and Thompson looked at Sean with absolute horror and total despair. Not only were their careers ruined, their complete humiliation had been broadcast live to thousands of people, permanently documented on the internet. Marcus and Michael exchanged a look that only twins can perfectly understand. They had masterfully transformed a situation of racial victimization into a devastating lesson about the real and permanent consequences of racism and abuse of power. Chief Morrison addressed the two brothers with genuine respect. "Captain Johnson, Commander Johnson, on behalf of the entire department and all honest officers who serve with integrity, I sincerely apologize for the absolutely unacceptable behavior of these former officers. This does not represent the values we defend." Michael finally spoke, his voice calm but loaded with deep meaning. "Chief Morrison, Agent Williams, Lieutenant Mitchell, we appreciate the quick and appropriate response, but we sincerely hope this case serves as a lasting example that institutional racism has real, severe, and permanent consequences. And that's how 2 hours of racial humiliation transformed into the complete and irreversible downfall of two men who thought they could intimidate people based solely on their skin color, discovering too late that they had chosen the wrong targets on the wrong night, facing adversaries who possessed not only the authority to destroy them, but also the strategic intelligence to do so devastatingly effectively. 6 months later, I was, sitting in my favorite blue velvet armchair, the one my late husband had given me on our 30th wedding anniversary, watching the evening news, when I saw a report that filled my heart with pride and emotion. My grandsons, Marcus and Michael, were being honored in a special and solemn ceremony at Chicago City Hall, receiving medals of honor for civil merit for their exemplary conduct and the transformative impact their case had generated throughout the community. The Murphy's Pub case had become much more than a simple incident. It had transformed into a historical landmark in the fight against institutional racism throughout the country. Rodriguez was not only fired, but also face serious federal charges for civil rights violations, being sentenced to 2 years in federal prison and 500 hours of mandatory community service in civil rights organizations. Thompson, being younger and having cooperated completely with all investigations, was fired but managed to avoid prison, being required to do 600 hours of community service in organizations that defend victims of racial discrimination. But the consequences and transformations went far beyond individual punishments. The case generated a complete and comprehensive federal investigation of the Chicago Police Department, resulting in the implementation of rigorous new training protocols on racial prejudice, the creation of a much more rigorous supervision program for all police approaches, and the establishment of a continuous monitoring system for police behavior. Marcus was promoted to regional commander, becoming responsible for personally supervising the implementation of reforms throughout the Metropolitan District. His first and most important initiative was to create a revolutionary partnership program between police and community, focused specifically on rebuilding lost trust in predominantly African-American neighborhoods that had suffered decades of abusive policing. Michael, in turn, was decorated by the Pentagon itself for his exemplary conduct and self-control during the incident. His supernatural calm and absolute professionalism under extreme pressure were cited as a perfect example of military leadership in complex civilian situations. He began giving regular lectures at military academies throughout the country on how to deal with discrimination and maintain dignity even when severely provoked. Murphy's Pub became an unexpected but powerful symbol of social justice and community transformation. Sean O'Malley, inspired by the events, transformed the establishment into a monthly meeting point for open discussions about civil rights, hosting events where police officers and community members could honestly dialogue about racial issues, building bridges where before there was only distrust and fear. The live broadcast of that fateful night had been viewed by more than 5 million people worldwide, generating a massive national movement of awareness about racial profiling and its devastating consequences. The video became mandatory training material in police academies throughout the country, viscerally showing the personal and professional consequences of institutional prejudice. But perhaps the most significant and lasting transformation happened in the local community itself. The elderly couple who witnessed everything, Harold and Margaret Peterson, became passionate civil rights activists in their 70s. They began religiously attending city council meetings, advocating for broader police reforms and greater accountability for all officers. "It's never too late to do the right thing," Margaret told me when I met her at the supermarket a few weeks after the incident. Seeing those two wonderful young men being treated in that degrading way opened our eyes to something we pretended not to see for too long. We can no longer be silent spectators of injustice. Chief Morrison implemented revolutionary and permanent changes throughout the department. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers without exception. A sophisticated anonymous complaint system was established with total protection for whistleblowers, and officers with multiple complaints began to be automatically investigated by an independent commission. She frequently cited the Johnson case as the moment when the department finally woke up to the brutal reality of racism in its ranks. Rodriguez, serving his sentence in a minimum federal prison, was forced to work at a community center in the same neighborhood where Marcus and Michael grew up. Ironically, he came to understand for the first time the communities he had spent 15 years unjustly persecuting. In a long and emotional letter he wrote to the Johnson brothers, he admitted, "You gave me the hardest, most humiliating, and most necessary lesson of my life. I hope one day to be able to redeem myself." Thompson, on the other hand, used his second chance constructively. He enrolled in night law school and began working as a volunteer public defender, dedicating his new career to protecting the rights of people he had previously persecuted. "That night showed me what kind of man I didn't want to be," he said in a television interview years later. "Marcus and Michael saved me from becoming a monster." Federal Agent Williams used the case as a fundamental basis for a comprehensive national investigation into systematic patterns of racial discrimination in police departments throughout the country. His detailed report resulted in mandatory federal reforms that positively affected hundreds of departments in all states. Marcus and Michael religiously continued their tradition of meeting monthly at Murphy's Pub, but now their meetings had a completely different and much deeper meaning. They became respected mentors for young officers and military personnel, teaching them about true leadership, personal dignity, and the fundamental importance of defending the values they swore to protect. "Grandma," Marcus told me during our traditional Sunday dinner, "that terrible night taught us that sometimes justice needs a little help from us. We can't simply passively wait for things to change. We have to be the active agents of the change we want to see." Michael nodded gravely, adding with wisdom, "And we learned that our position gives us not only privileges and opportunities, but enormous responsibilities. We have the moral duty to use our influence to protect those who have no voice or power." The most powerful and lasting lesson of this entire, extraordinary story, my dear ones, is that true strength doesn't come from intimidating or humiliating others, but from maintaining your dignity and integrity even when others desperately try to take that away from you. Marcus and Michael could have reacted with explosive anger, could have used their authority to simply humiliate Rodriguez and Thompson in a cruel and vindictive way. Instead, they used the justice system intelligently and strategically to create lasting changes that benefited the entire community. They taught me that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, personally, but transforming the world so that others don't have to go through what you went through. It's building solid bridges where before there were impassable walls. It's creating bright light where before there was only darkness and ignorance. Today, when I see my grandsons in their respected leadership positions working tirelessly to create a more just and equal world, I know that terrible night at Murphy's Pub transformed into something truly beautiful, a powerful lesson about how dignity, strategic intelligence, and perseverance can transform even the most unjust and painful situations into real opportunities for positive and lasting change. And you, who accompanied this transformative journey with us, always remember, when you face injustice in your life, don't let it transform you into something you're not or don't want to be. Use it as powerful fuel to become the person the world desperately needs you to be. If this story touched your heart and inspired you to be an agent of positive change in your own community, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share this message with everyone you love, because sometimes a single story has the transformative power to change many lives forever. The true victory of Marcus and Michael wasn't the personal downfall of Rodriguez and Thompson. It was the patient and determined construction of a better and more just world for future generations. And that, my dear ones, is the only revenge truly worth pursuing, because it transforms not only our own lives, but the lives of everyone around us.